Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Culture in Conversation, where we discuss how culture is experienced in everyday life. My name is Chan-Hoong, and I'm the host of the podcast. And today I'm very privileged to have Dr. Miriam Schwarzenthal, professor for the School Socialization Research at the Institute for Education Research at the University of Wuppertal, Germany. I hope I got it right. Miriam, how are
It
you
was
today?
fine.
Thank you. Great to have you on the program. It's lovely. I think I met you many years ago when, that was in Wellington. And I've seen you travel, and I think based on your bio on the website, you have traveled, lived, and studied in many different continents, including United States, Nepal, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. And you are the perfect person to talk about cultural differences because you actually live the differences yourself. And today we have the privilege to have you here and to get you talk about some of the research that you're doing in the area of critical consciousness. So perhaps I could like to begin by asking you to share with us what is this concept of critical consciousness, sorry. Can you tell us a bit about the construct and why is this important, Miriam?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be part of this podcast. And yeah, the concept of critical consciousness, it actually was developed by Brazilian educator Paulo Freire in the 70s. And
Mm,
he worked with marginalized peasants in Brazil. And he said basically that education shouldn't just teach them how to read or write, like teaching literacy. But he argued, yeah, we should also educate people to sort of be able to read the world, so to analyze social structures
mm,
that also produce marginalization and to have discussions about our own experiences with marginalization, basically. And he assumed
mm,
when we just discuss this and reflect on our own individual experiences, that then this could also result in a broader awareness of inequity in society.
mm,
And yeah,
mm,
this concept was actually picked up in recent years a lot in developmental psychology, and that's also interpreted a bit differently and mainly applied to adolescents nowadays. So not so much anymore to adults, but to adolescents. And that's also where my research connects, I think, because I do a lot of research in schools.
right,
And
right.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
this
it
modern
sounds a little
research,
bit
yeah.
I mean, it sounds a little bit like emotional quotient
Mhm,
EQ, right? I mean, cultural intelligence, and basically to be mindful of the environment,
mhm,
the surrounding, and how it is shaped by some of the power structures and so on.
mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, is there a difference between that of critical consciousness versus, say, that of
Mhm,
cultural intelligence or EQ?
mhm. I think it's a very interesting question, actually. So I would say there's definitely a difference because, at least my perception of intercultural competences, it's usually very much focused on how people interact, So maybe two people are engaging in a conversation, and then maybe intercultural issues are at play. And critical consciousness really kind of broadens our view. So critical consciousness really highlights the systems that we live in. So, for example, if a society is very hierarchical, critical consciousness would argue or like would ask, how does that impact also individuals? So how do the societal structures impact us? So it's less on this interpersonal level, but a lot about reflecting on systems. And I think that's the part
Mhm.
where it's really different from the concept of intercultural competence, I would say.
Right,
Mhm.
certainly. There's no doubt that in this day and age, in today's you know global context, we have become
Mhm.
more socially and economically unequal, if I may.
Mhm.
And are
Mhm.
people more aware of these structural disadvantages experienced by the various communities around
Mhm.
them? Or do you
Mhm.
see a decline in that sense of critical consciousness because we are all too busy dealing with our own problems? I mean, what are some of your,
Mhm.
thoughts on that?
Mhm. That's a very good question, I think. Like, I can just think of some research on meritocratic beliefs, for example, by Jonathan Mice from the Netherlands, who shows that, like, even though societies are quite unequal these days, still a lot of people endorse these meritocratic beliefs. So they still say, yeah, we think basically success mainly depends on individuals' effort or talent. And some people say that's sort of the opposing pole of critical consciousness, because critical consciousness really highlights this awareness of structural disadvantage and structural barriers. But others also argue maybe we can have some of both, So maybe there's also people who can say, yeah, we think that effort and hard work is quite relevant for how much success you have in life, but also there may be structural barriers. So I think that's actually very interesting questions if the two of them can also coexist to some degree.
Sure.
But yeah, as much as I know, there's not so much large-scale longitudinal data really examining it in detail, so I wouldn't really, argue there's very clear trends over time, and it's really this complex constellation also. Maybe you're aware of inequity in one domain, maybe not in the other domain, so I think it's very hard to just identify also one level of consciousness that one person has, because it may also depend on the topic, if you look at education, versus the job market, some people may be very aware of inequity in one, but not in the other. So, I think that's probably a very nuanced picture that we need there.
I suppose you have many different dimensions and different facades, and we wouldn't say that critical consciousness is the anti-meritocracy, being aware of the constraints and challenges faced by various communities doesn't have to be at the expense of affirming the importance of meritocratic values that we hold. I'm not an expert in critical consciousness, but from what I read, I sense that there are different components to that. One of which is to be cognitively mindful of the structural, the systemic disadvantages. Being cognitively mindful is one, and the other one is, of course, being proactive, taking proactive steps to address what will be the systemic imbalance. So in a similar vein, when I look at it, it sounds a little bit like, the psychological schism that we're all aware of in undergraduate education, the distinction between cognition and behavior or affect and behavior. So, knowing that something may not be right, but may not be sufficiently motivated enough to seek a redress. I don't know, is that the way you would interpret that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question that I also have been thinking about a lot, to be honest. So the parts you described, like the critical reflection component and the action component, in theory, they're supposed to be related to each other, also reciprocally related, but also findings on that, like sometimes the relations are found, sometimes not. And one study actually that we did in Germany, that was actually also the motivation behind that study to look at, do some people actually just engage in reflection, but they don't show any action intentions, and some people maybe engage in both. And what are the consequences of that? So that was actually exactly the question that we had there. And we did a survey study there with adolescents, and we actually identified 3 groups of adolescents that mirror, I think, pretty closely also the types of groups that you described there. So there was one group that was basically not reflecting a lot about injustice, and they also didn't show intentions to act against it. And there was one group that showed basically medium levels of reflection, but very high action intentions. So these we call basically the actionists, who really want to engage in action and they feel like they can intervene when they observe injustice. But the third group, I think, is the one that you were talking about, actually. So there was a group where the adolescents were pretty aware of injustice, but they barely showed, or like very low intentions to act against it. And we termed these the armchair activists, could also be understood with the negative terms. You could also call them maybe the bystanders, So I think that's actually really a bit what you described, that these were the adolescents. They're very aware, but they don't really see any ways to change the situation, right? And I think my main takeaway from that was, it's really not enough to just look at reflection, especially with young people. If we think about schools and schools promoting critical reflection, if it just remains at that level of reflection, that can potentially also cause quite disheartened adolescents, maybe hopelessness or frustration. So I think I would personally always advocate for, we also need to convey hope, like perspectives, maybe show the adolescents that also in the past there has been change, right? And systems have changed, laws have changed, and a lot of this was driven by individual people. So I think it's really important to encourage them, action is possible and change is possible. Right. And we also looked at the adaptation of the adolescents, actually. And this armchair activist group was actually the one with the worst socio-emotional academic adaptation. So, that I think reflects a bit, maybe that's our explanation for it. Maybe it was a bit disheartening, maybe frustration. So, I think action is really important. Hmm.
Yeah. Miriam, I recall your earlier life. You were looking at research on
Yeah.
multicultural
Mhm.
education,
Yeah.
intercultural competence, and I'm just wondering, like, given this construct, this nature of critical consciousness that we know, right? I mean, it sounds like a skill set. It sounds like something that
Mhm.
of moral character education. And I wonder if this is something that we can teach in schools, in the national
Mhm.
schools, and what is the evidence so far, as far as promoting
Mhm.
greater awareness of class differences and of the structural inequalities
Mhm.
and power hierarchies. I mean, what does it say so
Mhm.
far?
Mhm. Yeah, so there is, or I would definitely argue that schools can promote critical consciousness, but that doesn't mean that they actually do that right now, you know? So I think there's the potential, but
Mm,
at least our research findings also show not a lot of schools are emphasizing that so far, at least in
mm,
Germany, the schools that
mm,
we surveyed. So yeah, in some studies, for example, we asked adolescents if they perceive that their teachers actually talk to them about social inequity in class.
mm,
And we call this the critical consciousness classroom climate, basically. And we and also some other groups, they found that, yeah, that's actually related to the adolescents' individual critical consciousness, you know? So there's a link to what they perceive the teachers are talking about and to
right.
their own critical reflection of inequity and sometimes also to their action intention. So I think that's the first evidence we found there. And
Mm,
interestingly, though, because I think in this podcast we also talk a lot about culture, right? So
yes.
we also contrasted this with an approach of multiculturalism. So if the teachers actually talked a lot about culture in class, so if they encouraged the students to learn something about their heritage culture or about each other's cultures, and that approach usually was not related to critical consciousness. And I think that really also got me thinking that, yeah, just talking about culture, it's not maybe not always enough, especially in educational contexts in societies of
Mm,
immigration, because
mm,
that's also one thing actually, yeah, that really got me thinking during my PhD journey, where I really focused on intercultural competence and intercultural learning in class. And I also still believe that that's important, but I always encountered this basically this limit of the concept of intercultural competence in this context.
mm,
Because if you talk about culture in German schools, in many cases, culture is really essentialized, you know, and seen like it's only applied to minoritized groups. And then usually they're ascribed a certain culture, and that culture is often viewed as something that has a deficit or something more negative. So in this culture, the parents don't pay so much attention to education or are not as interested in education, you know, so it's often used really as a negative on deficit oriented attribution basically. Then
mm,
I always struggled with, okay, now when I talk about culture, but often culture is used in this negative way, you know, then
mm,
maybe just talking about culture is not enough.
mm,
So
mm,
that's actually why I turned also to this concept of critical consciousness, because I think that
mm,
really helps us think about how do social hierarchies and like
mm,
power dynamics in societies also shape what are the implications of talking
mm,
about culture, you know,
mm,
and what context do these intercultural interactions even take place, you know? So yeah, that's actually why I turned to that. And that's also why then later on I found it so interesting to
mm,
contrast the effects of multicultural or intercultural learning with the effects of critical consciousness
mm,
learning. And I think they each have their own like ups and downs or strengths, you know, and weaknesses. So yeah, that's why I turned to that. And actually recently we were working on a systematic review also about critical consciousness socialization at school. And they're really, because yeah, so many different fields of research have looked at different types of critical consciousness socialization, like critical pedagogy or ethnic studies in the US, critical literacy. So there's so much research on that, but in very different fields and often not
mm,
really integrated. And so our main question there was also, okay, what are the effects of discussing and teaching about social inequity at school?
mm,
And yeah, actually across all these different studies, I would also say yeah, schools can definitely also shape adolescents' critical consciousness, but maybe not all parts at the same level. So most of the effects we found were on the reflection of inequity again, but not
right.
on the action component. So yeah, relates a bit to what we discussed before, right? So
Yes.
mainly
Yeah.
reflection was emphasized and not action. Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, one part
Mhm.
of what you described a while ago,
Mhm.
I mean, really catches my attention because you said this is not something that is taught so much in schools. the critical consciousness part, and part of it, if I hear you correctly, it's got to do with the fact that this may not be like the kind of the core values, I suppose. I mean, do you see potentially there is a value or cultural or national priorities or national values in the teaching, in the way of teaching critical consciousness? I mean, I was just wondering, like, would this be an issue in some other cultures that might be, I suppose, more egalitarian, like the countries in, say, Scandinavia, or in Australia, New Zealand, for example, where the national values tend to be more egalitarian, and therefore they are more open to encouraging students to think about critical consciousness. Whereas in countries like the US, it's in not just highly individualistic, but it's very hierarchical, and people tend to not pay as much attention to the concept of power structures and critical consciousness. I don't know what are your thoughts on that?
I would definitely say that the societal context shapes to what degree you discuss these issues in class. So there was also something that when reading all these different studies for this review, they were all from different national contexts. I mean, the large share was from the US, but we also had studies from a lot of other contexts. And I think what was really interesting there, that some of them, they actually also reflected on, like, how does the current political climate, for example, shape to what degree schools talk about this topic, right? So in a lot of the US-based studies, there was discussion of the current restrictions, right? The like anti-immigration policies, and how that sometimes makes it very difficult to also establish these programs in schools. And I mean, there's been a lot of legislation also trying to ban critical pedagogy from schools, right?
Yes.
So that definitely also has an effect on to what extent that's discussed. And one other aspect that was mentioned, what I found really interesting, is that in some contexts, they said maybe students are not so used to basically critiquing or also speaking up to their teacher. If it's very hierarchical context, right? Then and critical pedagogy is very much based on the idea that in the school the relation should be less hierarchical, and it's dialogic education. It's not just the teacher like teaching you his view of the world, but it's really the students bringing in their perceptions and experiences. And so it's very much also like bottom up, dialogic education. And I think when the students are used to the teacher being this authority figure, and like basically just doing what the teacher tells you to do, I think that's a very challenging environment to really, foster these critical conversations, because it's also a bit about challenging authority and established norms, right? And I think that also definitely shapes it. And one thing I noticed in Germany, I think what's really interesting here when we go into the schools, and we also ask the students, like, do you perceive that your teacher discusses inequity, or do you perceive more of a color evasive climate where like similarities are emphasized and differences and discrimination is more downplayed? That this color evasive climate is actually the one they perceive the strongest. And one explanation here is also a bit actually historical, because based on Germany's history, we have a very, very bad history of talking about social categories, or of assessing people's ethnic, racial, religious group membership. I mean, in the past, this information was abused horribly, right? And so also when you want to talk about racism in Germany, lots of people always immediately think of the past, of these very extreme forms of atrocities, and they locate racism very much in right-wing extremism, and so people are often very, I think, cautious to discuss somehow group variations in class. And then it's the safer, or seen maybe as the safer option, to mainly highlight commonalities. But I think a downside of that is really that then a lot of schools, they also don't address this like everyday subtle forms of discrimination that a lot of students still face, because they just emphasize similarities, but they don't really think about these structural or subtle types of discrimination. And so I think, that's particular, but maybe also in other contexts, but that's something we definitely observed in Germany, why a lot of schools here, they don't discuss racism so much. But from what I hear from my students, I teach pre-service teachers, they are like, sometimes now they said, we actually did address these topics at school, and it often depended on one particular teacher who was really engaged, and wanted to bring that in. So I think it's maybe changing a bit. That is becoming more of a topic and more,
Yeah,
but not really
yeah.
widespread.
That's right. I guess it's
Mhm.
always a mixed bag of factors that
Mhm.
shapes the understanding of critical consciousness,
Mhm.
which kind of lead me to the next question because we hear a lot about the disruptive nature of technology, of
Mhm.
AI, and the social media
Mhm.
in particular. Is said to have a very significant impact in pulling communities apart. Because of the diversity because of the platform and how that, echoes or promote the echo chamber
Mhm.
effect. So you
Mhm.
don't get to hear diverse voices and
Mhm.
reinforce certain views and stereotypes that you have. Do
Mhm.
you see critical consciousness or the lack of, you know, um, focus in a
Mhm.
discussion of critical consciousness a victim of this technology curse? The fact that so much of our conversations
Mhm.
and discourse today is being
Mhm.
defined by social media.
Mhm.
And therefore, because of the
Mhm.
way, we see how the platform evolve and there are certain views of, the platform and
Mhm.
ideology and critical consciousness being one of them. And as a
Mhm.
result, people just shut themselves out from that whole conversation altogether. What are your thoughts on that?
Mhm. Yeah, good question. I think it's not easy to give a very like simple answer to that. Maybe I think it's really a complex picture there because on the one hand, I think this concept of echo chambers, I'm not sure that was really like, I think the last I heard or I read about that is that it's actually not as strong as we thought it was, that people still choose
Mm,
their own basically environments, right? And still have a degree of basically agency and, what they consume on social media and what they're confronted by. But I also think when it comes to critical consciousness, I think in general, like social media, definitely, I totally agree. It fosters these simplified narratives. It's all like short-term content and a TikTok video or like Insta post. You cannot really tell a very complex story about anything, right? So
mm,
I think on each end of the political spectrum, it fosters more simplistic narratives. And I think that's at least my perspective that that's actually quite different from what critical reflection as a component of critical consciousness actually entails, right? So
mm,
if you really look at the definition of critical reflection, it's all about analyzing and reflecting on inequity and also thinking about the structural and historical roots of inequity. And that's quite a complex process, right? Like if you really think about how did the policies of the past or maybe the school system now, how does that impact individuals? How does that produce inequity? That's quite a complex process, and it often
mm,
involves a lot of different factors that impact each other, from the macro societal system to microsystems of the family and the school, so it's a very complex um, process. And I think social media definitely is not really suited to engage in these sort of complex reflections or learning about these structures. But on the other hand, I think maybe it does have some potential. So I don't want to, say social media maybe is all bad.
yeah,
I
yeah.
do believe, and I think there's also some studies now. I can think of some from the US that found that some youth, for example, immigrant origin youth, they actually also build critical consciousness through social media. So they used it also as a platform for like pointing out injustice and also to connect to each other, so forming a community and then maybe feeling also collectively empowered, feeling more efficacy that you can do something if you find your community online. So I
Mm,
think there's definitely some potential in social media there to, also connect people who, especially if you belong to a minoritized group, you maybe in everyday life you don't often meet people who are in the same situation, and then social media offers you also
mm,
unique opportunities, right, to find people maybe with similar experiences or perspectives.
yeah.
So I think maybe there, it's also has some positive potential. And
Mm,
actually also in my interviews, so maybe not even just for minoritized populations, also I recently did some interviews with white ethnic majority German young adults.
mm,
And interestingly, a lot of them, like we asked them, what context did you learn about your cultural heritage and about racism in Germany? And actually, a lot of them also said, the first time I thought about these issues was through social media, like through watching some videos or posts of people pointing out incidents of like everyday daily discrimination and racism, or so I think at least that maybe can be a starting point for further reflection, and make you exposed to perspectives you're usually not exposed to in daily life. So
Right,
um,
right. I mean, and based on what you said, it's interesting because you kind of reminded all of us that there's always uh, there are two sides to the same coin, and there's always the positive and there's always the negative. And you know, on a any particular ideological spectrum, you always have two ends of the spectrum, and the opposite of critical consciousness may well be critical unconsciousness. The fact that you're taking a conscious approach not to look at it, or perhaps uh, did not see that as a challenge, right? That perhaps some of those issues that we face, it reflects a certain outcome that, is just the way it is. I mean, it's interesting that I hear this from you. I mean, that we're having this conversation because, you're in Germany and we all see, in the last couple of years, in fact, decades, Germany and Europe, with, in fact, all the countries, many countries in the world are undergoing through a lot of seismic transformation, not just in dealing with the challenges relating to migration, but also on the economic front, where we all wrangle with a lack of good jobs and the high cost of living. And for most people, the man on the streets, it's just not just dealing with the questions about inequality and what are some of the very entrenched structures that shape interactions, but also dealing with the challenges that they face. I mean, I'm just wondering, like, in the context of that, when we talk about a spectrum of ideology, it's interesting because we have so contradictory evidence. On the one hand, people think it's important, to be mindful of the structural inequalities that exist, but also on the other hand, people just accept it and just move on. So I don't know, how do you reconcile, that you have two different sides operating at the same time?
Yeah, I think, what you said reminded me a lot of this system justification theory, actually, right? That some people, or a lot of people have a motive basically to justify the existing system, right? And to portray it as fair and just. And that's also because if you say, like, the system I live in, it's actually a good system, it may reduce also uncertainty, provide a sense of stability, predictability. So that's also, right, if you constantly think about what is wrong with the world, it can also make you feel very uneasy, right? And also be a bit troubling. I mean, as we talked about before, if you just reflect a lot and you don't see a way forward, maybe it can be very discouraging, disheartening also. So I think that's one motive that people have for sure. But then again, I think we also need to look at like, who are we talking about? So there's a lot of people maybe who directly are affected by these inequitable structures, who maybe, if I think of some students at school who, like, every week again, it's questioned whether they really belong in Germany or not, and everybody always asks them, oh, why do you speak German so well? Or, so I think they experience that on a daily basis. So maybe when you're in that position, it's less of a choice whether you are aware of injustice or not, because you're just constantly confronted by it. I still think even for those youth, like, it's often like they benefit from spaces to reflect on these experiences. So not everybody translates these individual experiences then into this understanding of, our broad society is unfair, So I think that still requires some maybe education or spaces to share experiences. So, but I think, it's really important to consider this social positionality when we think about, are people basically also deliberately being a bit unconscious, And I think if we look at the other side, people who are maybe belonging to more privileged groups, I think for them often they can go through life without ever having to really think about these issues, right? Because maybe they benefit from it. They easily get that internship, because their father is already working in that company, or their uncle has connections, or the parents can easily finance them tutoring, So it's maybe easier for them to get good grades and get into a good school or a good university. So they never have to think about these topics that much. And yeah, when we study also issues around racism in schools, right? That's also something, if you're looking at more privileged populations, learning about that and learning that maybe like your position in life, you maybe didn't really just work for it, but you also have it because you belong to a group that's, generally maybe has an easier way to get there. I think it can also make you feel very either like guilty or angry or feeling negative emotions such as shame. So I guess sometimes people also just like to avoid going through that path, right? But eventually maybe we need to start reflecting on that to also think about, like, is it because we, I think I'm also belonging to a more or less privileged group, I would say, in Germany, and do we, want the system to be that way? I think a lot of people actually also have this motive. We want to be, fair people, live in a just society, right? So we also need to think about, like, what can we do to get there? And do we also need to reflect on our own position to get there? So, yeah.
Well, absolutely, Miriam. This is so exciting and so interesting. And thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here on this podcast. And we look forward to reading more about your research on critical consciousness in the years ahead. Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks so much for the invitation again. It was nice talking. And see you soon, wherever that will be.
Yes, definitely.